Yeah, just like, the kind of mic that I use is like kind of like, it's like kind of like what Drake uses. It's not a big deal or anything.
Same brand.
Yeah, it's like the same brand. It's cool. It's cool. Like, Drake trusts it. Life's a Wreck trusts it. It's a good mic. It's a good mic. It's got some big endorsements.
I don't know about that shirt that you're wearing, but I'm fine.
What,
I hope you're talking to Will.
Yeah.
What's wrong with my shirt? You don't like colors?
Did Gmon
Yeah, you do
hit
look
that
like
for
a
you?
grandma. That's actually legit.
You don't like getting off the grayscale?
And then you have the sponsored gym shirt underneath you. What does that gym shirt say?
It's a jiu-jitsu shirt.
Of
I
course
fight.
it
I don't
is.
know. It's weird. I just fight and stuff. But
Of course it
Typical.
is.
anyways, we got Mose on the call. What's going on, man?
Oh, we
It's been a
started.
while.
Oh, great.
Cold intro. How you doing?
Good to know. How's it going, boys? I appreciate you guys having me on. This is a proud moment for me. This is like when a father gets to see his kid step on the soccer field for the first time, or like pick up his first hockey stick. Like, this is big for me. I'm proud of you guys.
Well, yeah, you did start a podcast well before us. And I remember that summer, July 2019.
It was a great summer. A lot of
It was
fun.
a very good summer. Nothing like this last summer, clearly. But it's been over a year. So, like, how does that feel with having a podcast around for, more than 365?
Honestly, it's kind of cool to be able to see, like, to get those notifications sometimes on like Facebook, when you get those like 1 year memories and stuff, to get those, but it's like with guests that you've interviewed and that kind of stuff. It's like, oh wow, like I don't know, it's a sense of accomplishment. It's like I stuck with something for a year. I stuck with a creative project for longer than a few months. And yeah, I don't know. It's definitely like I'm proud of it, to be honest. Like, it's a lot of fun. It keeps growing. It keeps, I'm able to talk to more and more incredible people all the time. It's a lot of fun. I love it.
I feel like it's one of those things that definitely gets easier over time as well.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing is like every time, and I'm sure you guys will see this as well, like every time you do a podcast, you learn something new, whether it's something that you're saying, if you're repeating, those things a lot, which I'm terrible for, or like how to get the most out of a guest or anything like that. Like, you pick up on little things every time. So yeah, it definitely does get easier, but you're constantly like learning new stuff, which is great. And then the more people you connect with and the more people who give you their perspective, I had the opportunity to talk with a really incredible woman the other day, Jen Tryon, who works with Global, and she was talking about like, the interview process and a good line of questioning and how to get the most out of your interview. And everything that I took from that, I've been able to implement into the podcast. And it's, I did an episode just the other day, and I used some of the tips that she gave me, and I thought it was one of the best interviews I've done. So you're always learning new stuff. It's great. But yeah, it definitely does get easier for sure.
Well, what made you decide to do the mental health podcast? Because, we became friends at the gym, and I think we actually did record a podcast last summer about just the gym and fitness and mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, why don't we go into how we all met? Because
I love it.
This is kind of a funny story. So who wants to kick it off?
I mean, go for it. I would love to get your guys' perspective. I listened to your last podcast, the one with Juan and Pigsy, and it seemed like you guys mentioned me once or twice. So I'd love to just get your guys' perspective on meeting me for the first time. How we met, that whole story. That'd be great.
See, the only thing I knew about you was at that networking event at Sportsnet.
Stud.
Scott Moore was just like, when we're all leaving, he's like, by the way, is Kyle Moore here? And I'm like, okay, this guy's just like some like hot shot already.
He's a
Like,
big
I'm just
dog.
leaving with my shitty maroon sweater over top of this button shirt.
Yeah.
Like, I look terrible.
Yeah, that's a funny story.
But that's my first like knowledge of you, and then I didn't really know anyone for 2 years. I just really knew Max. I stayed away from
you were a
everyone
ghost.
at school. I was a ghost.
Yeah,
and then
honestly.
meet you at, I think I met you through Mose. Is that true?
I mean, that's usually
Probably,
how people
yeah.
meet people in our program, right?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, like, I know that that networking event was like, looking back on that was so funny. I connected with Scott Moore when I was in grade 11 for the first time, and that had kind of been like this one big build up, and then that event was happening. It was at Sportsnet, and I wore like the same suit that I wore to my interview, which Mose loves so much, and man, honestly, like, it was one of those situations where I honestly, thinking back about like, how I've networked and that kind of stuff has been interesting, because I think like a lot of the time I look back and I'm like, why the fuck did I do that? why did I do that? Like when Scott Moore was like, hey, is Kyle Moore here? Like, why did I hop over one row of chairs to like go and like see him and not like walk around?
I remember
and, like,
that.
You remember
I
that?
don't remember this.
God.
I don't remember this at all. Hold on, wait, time out. You jumped over a row of chairs?
Okay, jumped is a strong word, but like he said, he's like, is Kyle Moore here? And I was like, and so I was sitting, so like here's like the stage is, you know, up front or whatever, and that's where Scott is. And there was 3 rows of chairs, and I think I was in the third. Like it was like a theater, right? It's like a theater where like an auditorium or some shit. And there was like 1, 2, 3, and I'm pretty sure I was in the second row, and the first row was like the floor, and that's where Scott was. And so I was like right in front of him, and so I was like, oh, like this logically in my mind at the time, I was so, and granted, like this was like my first like shot at meeting a guy who I had networked with. I had like put a ton of time into building that relationship, and the first like and how I introduced myself was literally by like standing up and being like, oh, I'm right here, and like swinging my leg over the chairs in front of me and like just kind of like skipping over that just so that I could go down and meet him. And I remember he had a good laugh about it, and so did I. Ended up working with the guy, so yeah, I mean it worked, but working for the guy, sorry.
And let's just put a little context for those that don't know. Scott Moore, at the time that you met him, was the president or CEO, or he was in
president
charge of
Sportsnet.
Sportsnet. Yeah, exactly. And he's later gone on to start in Uninterrupted Canada with Drake. So this guy's a big deal. From the visual that you just painted, I'm picturing a young Kyle Moore at a New Brunswick track meet on a set of bleachers, not knowing that he's running the 100-meter dash, and jumping down 3 rows of seat, tearing off his track pants and getting ready. And you just seem so
essentially
eager.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I hate that I missed that, because if I knew that happened, I would have given you such a harder time for it.
And honestly, I wish somebody had of, because I was overly eager, and I think that that's happened more than enough where I've been like, I've gotten caught up in the moment, and I've kind of like, I've like done things that I'm like, oh, that could come off as like quirky and authentic, or it could come off as like, that's kind of weird. So I've towed a fine line, but it's worked out so far, so can't complain.
Yeah, slight trend, you know.
Yeah.
You could say that. And then, so that's the last thing. That's the first time I've heard of you. Pretty much the last. I didn't really know you at all. And then I think it was like January 2019. I don't know. It was one of you guys like, oh, you're going to the gym? Oh, cool. Yeah, man. How you been? Start to get to know each other through that. And then like, what was it? 5 months later, you start the pod. So like, when did you think to start the pod?
I mean, like I was at a weird time in my life when I started the podcast. So like I had went through a breakup, and that was something that, you know, Will and I had kind of we just bonded over sadness. It was great. But Will just perpetually lives in that sadness, but it's fine. I've moved past. I have a podcast and stuff. It's cool. But what happened, like the reason that I started the podcast is because I was going through a breakup. I was still pretty miserable about that. I was in the throes of anxiety and OCD, and it was kind of like the worst it had ever been for me. And I was working, it was the first summer that I was going to stay in Toronto. I told my parents, I was like Sportsnet, I'm interning at Sportsnet. I'm going to get a job. Don't worry about it. I got this on lock. I've networked. I've done all these things right, blah, blah, blah. And so we decided, my family and I, my family's from the East Coast, and we decided, we were like, okay, I'm going to stay there. I'm going to stay in my apartment. I loved where I was. Shout out to 123 Seton. Great place. A lot of great memories there. True. Yeah, the neighborhood could have been cleaned up a little bit. That's fine. That's another conversation. And I was essentially, so basically my internship finished at Sportsnet. They brought me into the office, and I was like, yeah, I'd really love to like work here this summer. And I hadn't had a job. Like when I told my parents I was going to stay, I'm like, I'm going to get a job. Don't worry about it. And it just didn't happen. And so they were like, sorry, big guy, not your time. And I was like, okay, like I don't know what I'm going to do. So basically I was just job searching, and I ended up taking a bartending course. And at the bartending course, I met this gentleman, and he said that he worked in the cannabis industry. And I was like, oh, the cannabis industry, that's a cool industry. It's a hot industry to be in right now. I've got a media background. I might be able to kind of make something out of this. And so he introduced me to his business partner, blah, 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 blah. Long story short, the guy that I was introduced to at the bartending course, he takes off and moves to BC. I never hear from him again. And the guy, his business partner, was like, hey, let's keep working together. And me and my being naive and just totally desperate for a job, he's like, I'll give you essentially shares in this company that I'm starting if you are effectively my assistant. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. You know, by the end of the summer, like this guy's got some capital and whatever. And anyway, the only time I was ever paid was when I helped pack up this guy's apartment and clean. And so basically I was without a job. I had just been strung along by this guy for like 2 months. I was miserable. I was depressed. And I was like, you know what? Like, I have to do something or I'm going to drive myself like literally crazy. And I had a background in radio and just thought, you know what? Like, let's just start talking about how crazy my life, like how fucked up my life is right now. And Life's a Wreck was born.
Right, so you start the podcast, and like, what was it like? I mean, did you do much audio stuff before? Like, you're now you're a self-proclaimed audio guy now. Like,
Audio
you're
god,
master
not
of the
just
trade.
guy, a god.
Whoa. Well, audio god who can't apparently get his audio right for this Zoom call. So
Which is fine. I helped you figure that out, I guess.
right, yeah. If it wasn't for Will, I'd be essentially nothing.
Audio guy. But like, what were like the biggest? Like, can you walk us through like the hurdles you had to like jump over or that you crashed into as you were starting it? Because I know we're what is this, 8th episode? Like, we've had a lot of issues to deal with, but like every episode seems to get better and better, and just distributing is better. But why don't you share like what went on with your journey at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so there have been like a million and one things that I've ran into that I've been like, holy shit, like this sucks. Like, I don't know how to figure this out. When I first started the podcast, first and foremost, like I downloaded Audacity, which is a free audio editing software, which I still use, not for the entire podcast, but I use for elements of it, just because it's like so easy to move stuff around. It's so basic. Excuse me. So I started using that, and I ran into, on my old laptop, I ran into the fact that Audacity would crash all the time. And so I would record entire episodes. You guys, I literally recorded an episode with you guys, and during the editing process, Audacity would crash. I'd lose everything, and it was miserable. And so there would be nights where I'd say, because when I first released it, it was a weekly podcast, and so it'd be like Thursday night, and I'd be editing it, and it would crash and die, and I'd be like, oh my god, I have to get a podcast out for tomorrow. And so I'd basically be sitting up until like 2 a.m, like just getting like verbal diarrhea out and whatever. And then in the morning I'd have to wake up at like 5. I'd get like 3 hours of sleep, and I'd have to edit it for 4 hours because I didn't know what I was doing with the editing. So that was a mess within itself. But yeah, so that was like technical stuff was tough. I mean, learning how to use Audacity, even at the time, like I had no experience in any kind of editing stuff. I didn't necessarily know what I wanted the podcast to be. I didn't know. And honestly, I had such high hopes for the podcast after like the first few, because they got like a couple hundred. My first episode now has like 450 listens or something like that.
Not a big deal.
I
think ours has like 35.
Yeah, well, it was one of those things like when a random guy like pops up who you've been friends with for forever, especially from a small town, like, hey, I'm gonna start a mental health podcast about how much of a fuck up I am. Everybody in my hometown was like, oh, let's check it out. So the first episode did crazy well. The second episode did like 150. The third episode did like 100. And I was like, oh shit, I got it. I did it. Like 3 episodes in, I was like, I figured it out. I cracked the code. Like virality, here I come.
So you got a little excited. Like
I got way too excited
when you first met Scott Moore. It's kind of the same thing. You're probably jumping around the house, looking in the mirror for a little too long.
Exactly. Yeah. It was definitely like, it was a humbling thing, because I was like, I'm gonna monetize this within like a month. Like I'm going to like, and basically I told like, and the worst part was, and the part that I've learned is that like when it comes to podcasting, move in silence. Do the hard work behind the scenes. And although like I let the people who listen and my followers or whatever into my life like pretty intimately, I talk a lot about the ups and downs and whatever. When it comes to the podcast, I've learned to talk less about what I'm doing with the podcast and have them just kind of, because I felt this innate when I told on the podcast, I was like, things are going really well, like I'm probably gonna have like this guest and this guest, and I almost kind of started to like get in my like, I don't know, like get my bag, I guess, or like let my ego get the best of me, where I was like, oh, like this is going to be the next big thing, stick around kind of thing. And it just was one of those things where I completely had burnout because of the fact that I was working so hard to try to meet this level that I had set, and I felt like I was being held responsible to by the people that I had told. And so like that was a huge thing as well, is to like find balance between, okay, here's what I want to tell the people who are supporting me and who are following me, and here's what I want to do because I'm not 100% sure if that's going to work out yet or not. So that was definitely a tough thing. And the fact that like I had no social media experience as well. Like your guys' social is like lights out. It's like super good because you've got Mose who, TSN at 18, not a big deal. You've got Will, who's just Will, like, one of the premier like editing guys and like our from our program and stuff. Hey, you thought I was going to take a little shit on you there.
I was waiting for it. Yo, Will,
Will's Will. You've got this.
Fucking captain of the ship. I gotta get my crack the whip.
He's the details
How do you
guy.
think I get it? How do you think we get anything done?
Yeah.
Okay,
exactly.
come on.
Dude, I have checklists.
We've been friends
checklists.
for how long? I know he's the details guy. Man, Mose helped me with a media pack that I needed 4 months ago, and I just got it a couple days ago.
It's fantastic.
Wow. Yeah, I'm still waiting on a website. It's just the list goes on and on and on. But that's fine.
Doesn't stop.
It's
I'm just
fine.
in such demand. It's fine.
Listen,
That's true.
guys.
It's a hot ticket.
Mose has the vision. I execute. So, anyways,
so that was another thing too, is like you guys have, from what I've heard, you guys have really good engagement on your Instagram versus me. Like when I started Life's a Wreck, the podcast Instagram, which is at Life's a Wreck podcast, whatever. It was brutal. Yeah, not a big deal. It was brutal. Like there was nothing on there, and like I had no idea how to get like audio snippets. I had no idea like what I should be putting out, quote graphics, anything like that. And so basically, like the views for the podcast, everything started to like trickle off. Like I had this really great start, and I just didn't necessarily have the means of carrying that momentum on. So yeah, that was definitely another issue that I ran in was learning how to like leverage social and just make like a more appealing product to be able to give to your listeners.
I want to circle back quickly to the editing part of it, because as you mentioned, you didn't have any experience with audio editing.
Yeah.
But if somebody was to listen to your podcast and then listen to our podcast, I think it's pretty clear who puts more effort into the audio experience. You do some really interesting things with your intros and kind of the characters that you make, but that definitely didn't come from day one. So I just want you to kind of talk about what was the process like learning that, and the way that I think about it, me and Will talk a lot about kind of the balance between quality and the effort that you put in versus how do you make this sustainable? Because like you said, we don't want to have a situation where we get some really good viewership and engagement on the first 4 episodes, but then we kind of trail off because it becomes too difficult to put this out consistently. So maybe talk about your thought process learning to edit podcasts like you do, and kind of the unique take that you bring to editing your podcast.
It's a really good question. I mean, like, I definitely kind of think like the whole point of starting Life's a Wreck was I wanted to create something that like my younger self could have used. Like when I was going through kind of hard times, like I could have listened to this podcast. And I know with me, with being, OCD and stuff like that, like I a lot of the times will find things to distract myself, whether it's mentally or like physically with like I'm very tactile, like so like I'll just start playing with something and then all of a sudden I'm not paying attention at all. And so I realized that like the way that I would stay engaged if I was listening to a podcast is if it has like a little bit extra something. It's got some soundscapes, it's got some characters, it's got things that are bringing you in, things that are almost like inside jokes that if you listen to the podcast a lot, you're going to pick up on things, blah, 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 blah. And the intro was, so basically for my podcast, I do like a funny little skit intro. They're not always funny. I just say they are. But I do this little intro at the beginning of every one. And honestly, the reason that I started that was I wanted to learn the audio editing. And I thought if I do a different skit at the beginning of every one, it's going to challenge me with new things that I'm going to have to be forced to learn. And so whether that's like learning how to use reverb to create like distance and whatever, and be able to create setting by using audio effects, I wanted to force myself to learn. And I knew that if I just kind of just had a podcast where I was just talking and I threw it out there, I wouldn't learn anything. I would just do the same thing. I'd get caught in this repetitive cycle. So I was like, I'm going to do this new thing every week so that I can force myself to learn more about the world of audio, because I wanted to have a really high caliber podcast that had production value of a professional podcast, but at an amateur level. and yeah, I just wanted something that was going to set me apart. There's a million podcasts out there. And I just thought, and there's a lot of mental health podcasts as well. So I thought I have to do something that's going to set myself apart. And I figured that adding these like little things, these little jokes, these little characters, whatever, this voice in the background, this voice in my head would be a way to distinguish myself from other mental health podcasts and allow me to kind of build somewhat of a follower base that is specifically attracted to mental health podcasts because of my podcast, because they like how casual it is, they like how fun it is, they like how light it is, even though we're talking about some really heavy stuff. Yeah, man. I mean, honestly, like learning that process, like it sucked. Like those are some long, I'm still like with Logic and stuff, which is the main editing software that I use now. I am still learning, like every day I'm watching different tutorial videos and whatever on how to do certain things. And it's tough. Like it's a long, you guys can both relate. Like, you know what I mean? When you're learning something that's so intricate, like editing, there's a million different variations that you have to like take into consideration. If you add this and then that, it's going to create this. If you add, it's like, it's basically like math. So it's tough. But yeah, I just wanted a really nice polished podcast. And I think that like over the past year, it's kind of become a lot easier to find that area where I can put a level of production into it that is sustainable. Because like when I first started it, like if you listen to and I actually kind of like going back and listening to my first few episodes because they're shorter. They're like 20-minute episodes, 30-minute episodes, but they took like 7 hours to edit because I'd put background music in, I'd put soundscapes. When I would tell a story, I would put a sound, like I'd do the, like if I was like, oh, I'm running through a forest, I would try to make a running through a forest thing, which sometimes I'd have to go and edit a whole new sound just to be able to put that in there for a 30-second bit. So like it's one of those things, like the production quality or the production value was like off the charts. It was great, but I couldn't do that on a weekly basis. So now I'm at the point where I've got the podcast when I'm doing a lot of interviews now. So when I've got the interview, it's just the interview. But then I got the intro, which is when I can have my characters, when I can have my fun. The outro, I can have my characters, have my fun. And then the intro to the actual podcast can do that. And it's a lot easier. It takes maybe 3 to 4 hours per episode versus like 7. And I do it on a bi-weekly basis, which gives me some more time to work on other projects, continue to grow the brand, and just find a much more healthy life balance for sure.
Something I grapple with a lot is like I want to make the edit of the podcast, because I edit the podcast, as good as possible and like kind of make things tighter and whatnot. But I almost find like it's every podcast model is different, but I watch all these podcasts like Spit and Chicklets or like Call Her Daddy, and I'm like, the production quality is so low, but the product is so good and it does so well. It's almost like, do you have like, how much value is in editing, like a lot, in trying to add extra sounds, music, etc. Like, do you think you'll ever transition away from that, or do you think you want to establish yourself in that with that model?
See, I think like with things like, it's like how perfect of a personality are you? Like with Chicklets and with Call Her Daddy, like those are podcasts that are so personality driven. It's like people like Alex Cooper could start a podcast tomorrow that's not Call Her Daddy and people would still go listen because they're listening to Call Her Daddy for her. And so I think that with my podcast, I want the production to essentially be a extremity of who I am. So I want like the Kyle Moore brand to carry with it a level of production. I want it to be one of those things where like I can put out personality driven content, but that personality driven content will also have a certain level of production value that's just inherently connected to who I am. So that's kind of where I think going forward, regardless of what I do, whether Life's a Wreck develops into something else, or, I start a new podcast down the road or whatever, I think that there will always be a level of production that like I think that like I've developed somewhat like a small brand around that expectation. And I think that like it also helps because like I'm not an Alex Cooper, I'm not a Paul Bissonnette, and that's just like nobody is, you know what I mean? So that's something that I have to like, I can continue to grow as a personality, I can continue to grow as like a entertainer and whatever, but having that extra little thing in my back pocket, it does help me I feel like grow and will be a part of the brand going forward for sure.
So I was going to say, I think brands are really like mysterious black box things, and that people don't really understand it. But what it comes down to for me is that you have low variance, as in things don't really change week to week no matter what you do. and you have some definition of quality that separates you from other people. So at the cost of your mental health sometimes, especially in the beginning, like you've mentioned, how do you square away those 7-8 hours that you were taking to make the podcast? Ironically enough, doing a podcast on mental health when it came at the expense of your mental health, because I think that's something tricky where some of the conversations about mental health recently have been
on blast.
You should no. I'm saying that a lot of the conversation with mental health recently is that we should always be happy and that we should put a lot of effort into taking care of ourselves, which I think is valid. But at the same time, I look at activities like going to the gym or starting your own thing that are painful and that require effort and that put you outside of your comfort zone, which kind of is in conflict with this idea that you should always be happy. So how did you square those things away? And then as a follow-up, I think that one of the best parts about starting this podcast with Will is that it always felt like there was somebody else in the trenches with you. And that wasn't the case with you because you did it alone. So kind of how did you navigate that beginning of the podcast? What's changed since then? And how do you square away your mental health, taking care of yourself versus putting the extra time into the podcast, pushing yourself when you're tired, when the audio recording stops and you're like, fuck, I have to do this again. I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
It's 1 a.m. in the morning. I'd rather be sleeping right now. Like, how do you square those things away in your head?
See, that's something that I've like that you basically like essentially just hit the nail on the head of the thing that's like I've fought with for the past year and however long the podcast has been out, because I am a mental health podcaster. What I do is preach mental health and mental wellness, but like more than I can count, the podcast has become a detriment to my mental health because of the work that I've had to put in, the long hours, especially when I was in school. Holy shit, that was like when I had the job at Mill Street serving. I was working at Uninterrupted Canada. And I had the podcast and school. I literally, like, I was, and you guys know, like, I was not only very unhappy, but I was like sleeping like 4 hours a night, maybe if I was like lucky. And that was, and it was because at the time, like, not only has this podcast grown over this past year, but I have it too as a person. And the more that more time I spend in the world of mental health, the more that my mindset changes and the more that I've developed mentally as well. So I think that like what I do now, the whole point of making it a bi-weekly podcast was to help my mental health, was so that I had more time between episodes to edit, to put that production value that I wanted to into it. And then it was, instead of, let's say, spending, as I said, the podcast now takes me about 4 hours to edit. Instead of having that 4 hours be on a weekly basis, so it's like 8 hours a week, I have to, essentially a whole work day, I have to try to find somewhere to edit the podcast. It's like I can spread that, like, for instance, later today, I'm going to listen through the podcast that I'm going to put out this week. I'm going to edit it. I'm going to take out all the ums, the buts, whatever, bleep out all the swear words, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to do that. And that's an hour process, hour plus. So I'm going to get that out of the way. Then tomorrow I'll work on getting the intro done. Then the next day I'll work on getting the outro done. And then on Friday morning or Thursday night, I'll put out all the pieces together like a little jigsaw, and that'll be the product. So it's a lot easier. It's like I found a groove. Yeah, man, it's one of those things. It's like it's such a weird thing, because anytime you're doing creative work, you do have to sacrifice a little bit of yourself, because you're putting. I think it's like one of those things. It's like you kind of have to pay the piper. You're putting a little bit of yourself into everything that every piece of content that you put out, because those are your man hours. That is your creativity. It's you. You're putting it into this thing. So you just have to be willing to do it. And I think the other thing is you have to be somewhat willing to make sacrifices, and that's just something that you have to come to grips with. It's like, if you're really dedicated to doing a certain thing a certain way, you have to essentially revolve your life around it, even if it's something small. Like, and it's tough, because like revolve your life around is such an extreme thing, but like a big part of my life now is this podcast that, isn't a multi-million-dollar podcast. It's a small startup podcast, but it's a huge aspect of my life. It takes up a ton of my time. So like it does essentially become a large part of like your day to day, and you just have to love it. You have to be willing to sacrifice a little bit, but at the end of the day, you have to be willing to like also look back and say, wow, like it was worth it. Like I've had people reach out to me and friends who I've had my entire life who talk about their mental health struggles and talk about their, suicide suicide attempts and that kind of stuff, and and talk about how having the podcast as an outlet and having people to talk to and understanding that like these things exist has helped them. So I don't know, for me it's all like a give and take, and a lot of trial and error. That's any kind of creative work, is trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. I've tried a million different things. I've tried weekly, tried bi-weekly, I've tried no editing, I've tried a ton of editing, and now it's like you eventually find it where it's like, okay, this is a good sweet spot.
It is crazy how when you're doing something weekly, I know you're doing every other week, but like for us, we're doing every Friday we drop, and it just creeps up on you. And our podcast is like pretty low maintenance, but we try to do a lot more like other content for it, which takes up a lot of time. And it's like, it's kind of like every day you're thinking about it. Yeah. And I'm doing YouTube as well. On top of that, it's like, oh my God, like it's like almost Tuesday when I'm supposed to post. Like it's insane how it consumes your life. I'm assuming if you get a producer, like someone who does like the editing for you.
I forgot the follow-up question from Mose.
That would change that a bit. But what was the follow-up?
Well, the follow-up was like doing it alone. And when you were talking about that, what I was going to say is like, I haven't really done it alone. I've had, when I first started the podcast, I had you guys who could help me out with some of the more bigger pieces of content or the bigger interviews that I did. I've had Will take pictures for me and shoot video. I've had Mose create graphics. Like you guys have been a huge help to the start of the podcast. And then when I moved back home, I've got my buddy Alistair, who's done some video work. He's done some graphic work. And I've had a ton of different people be able to give me their input, and you could call them kind of like mentors or people who have helped along the way. So even though I've done it, it's like been a one-man show. It's been a one-man show, but there's been some people behind the scenes who have done a lot of work as well. Would I love somebody else to do this podcast with? Like down the road, probably, yeah, for sure. Like it, being able to take a little bit of responsibility off my plate would be great. Or somebody who it's like, because like I have a mental health podcast. I have shitty mental health days where like I can't bring myself to edit the podcast. Would it be nice to have somebody who can kind of pick up that slack if I'm kind of feeling shitty? That'd be awesome. But as of right now, I've got people who can kind of be supports for me, and yeah, it's still working out. So
yeah, I definitely think if I was doing a podcast alone, it'd just be so tough to show up every week, every day, trying to like make new content, come up with ideas. Like I find like Mose and I have our pros and cons. Like I lean on Mose for certain things, he leans on me, and we kind of like push each other in the right direction. And I think it's gonna make us not just make a better product, but like consistently put out product. So Mose has a saying, it's harder to be consistent than it is to be good. And ultimately, you just got to show up every week. And if you never stop, one day you're going to break through if you're constantly adjusting and learning. So that's one reason I wanted to start with a person, is because I know it's faster alone, but farther together, So that's why I wanted to start with someone rather than being solo.
I'm totally with you. Like, I mean, like, I don't know, it's tough because I think at this point, like, Life's Rec is kind of my baby. So you know what I mean? It would be tough to like have somebody else have a significant input on how the podcast goes. But yeah, no, dude, showing up every week was like brutally hard. And that's kind of in the mentality though, is like, I think I need to hold myself responsible. In some aspects of my life, I need to have some structure, and that's just something that like is important to me. So especially when I moved back home and COVID hit and I lost all the structure that was in my life, still having the podcast definitely still gave me a bit of an anchor that like I could still work with. And yeah, no, dude, that's always something that I remind myself. So two driving factors that continue to push the podcast forward. Number one, I do it for my younger self. I do it like as like almost like a bit of a thank you for just kind of like sticking around and sticking through the tough times, and like doing it a little bit and kind of just like not in memory. It sounds so fucking dark, but like you're just kind of doing it like out of respect a little bit. And then the other thing too is like, as you said, being consistent. Like I feel like I've been semi-consistent for, give or take a year and a bit now. So like, I'm like, I've done it for this long. I'm going to keep doing it. And even if it doesn't lead to some, this podcast doesn't break out and become this next big, wave of mental health or whatever, it's like still having all that experience and everything, I still think is going to lead to good things. So yeah, just a bit of a looking forward to the future and then respecting the past, I guess. As weird as taboo as that sounds.
No, I think it's interesting to hear the why behind it, because I don't think that's immediately obvious sometimes, especially to people who don't listen to your podcast. I think mental health is definitely kind of in a place where it needs a rebrand, because a lot of times I think people associate it with weakness, which definitely hasn't been my experience. The more that you kind of spend time working on yourself and understanding how you work, the better that I've been for it. I want to talk about short form content. We had touched on it earlier a little bit. We're seeing really great growth when we kind of cut up the podcast on Instagram. In terms of what the future looks like for Life's a Rec, you talked that you had moved from posting weekly to posting bi-weekly. In terms of what you're doing outside of the podcast, maybe talk about that a little bit. And I even have some ideas for you, so we'll save those for later. But maybe talk about Instagram, social media, and kind of what you're doing there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, that's the thing is like when I'm spending a lot of time learning editing stuff and you know the world of audio, which is a deep dark place. So like exploring all that, it takes time. So like I haven't had the opportunity to dive into the world of like graphics and aesthetic and how to make you know, how to lay out a Instagram page so that it's appealing and that it instantly grabs attention, all that kind of stuff. So that's something that like going forward, I'm definitely going to be looking to get more experience in. So yeah, like I've just been using Canva just as like a super easy way that I can make sure that I get content out, that it fits, you know, it's got the brand colors, it's got the branding, whatever on it. And just a super easy way that like I can still focus on the audio stuff. And then that's like pretty easy. I can get a couple clips from the episode. I can send them to my buddy Alistair. He can chop them up. He can put them out. But yeah, definitely like upping the social media game's huge. Merch is something that I'm looking at right now. Hopefully by like middle of November, I should have merch, which would be cool. And then from there be able to grow the brand more like as somewhat of a lifestyle brand. You know, mental health being rebranded is something that I definitely think about a lot. And I think is why in this space, I have a bit of an opportunity that I don't want to pass up because of the fact that I am a decently attractive straight white guy who played a ton of sports, who, you know, quote unquote, you could say is like kind of cool. Not everybody would say that, pretty much just me, but like, I still think that like you kind of need a face of mental health that like so often, and this is the thing, is that like a lot of mental health content has been focused towards women, members of the LGBTQ community, minority groups, and that's the thing is it's like it's one of those things where I don't think mental health doesn't have a face, so you need representation from groups that haven't necessarily been marginalized, which is a weird thing to talk about, but you need to kind of just show that like mental health is a human problem, and it affects men, it affects women, it affects people of all races and ethnicities and everything like that. So I have an opportunity where I can show people who are growing up in traditional households that it's okay for them to struggle with mental health, and that they don't have to kind of like shy away from bringing it up to their family. Because like I got nothing to complain about. I got two great parents. I got a roof over my head. I got literally like the blue collar dream. Live in like a nice town in the middle of nowhere, New Brunswick, you know, go to the beach all the time, that kind of stuff. So like, just like I don't have any reason to necessarily be mentally ill or struggle mentally, but yet I do. And so just talking about that and putting that out there, I think is big. I'm also now just realizing that I completely forgot where I was going with this. I'm going on an absolute tangent.
No, that's good. It's good. I think you brought up some good things, especially from when I think about you started in July 2019. I think that mental health has become a bigger point of conversation, especially with COVID. And I mean, suicide rates, I can speak personally in Thunder Bay, where I'm from. There's kids that I've gone to high school with that have passed away, and it's definitely something that's kind of top of mind in the community. But that definitely wasn't the case when you started. So maybe talk about the challenges that you face talking about mental health, especially with men, which I think to your point with, I think there's a narrative that has been around for a while that men can't have emotions and they can't struggle with things. And obviously putting yourself out there and being vulnerable, that couldn't have been easy. So maybe talk about some of the struggles that came along with that.
Yeah. Well, like I said, like, and I've said it on a million different podcasts, like I have no discernible reason for why I shouldn't feel like I shouldn't be happy. I never experienced, I was so fortunate to have two loving, supportive parents, never experienced abuse. I had a great friend group. I never experienced bullying. I did drama. I was an honor roll student. I played a ton of sports. Like there was literally no aspect of my life that you could look at from the outside and be like, That's why. Like, that's it. And so honestly, it was one of those things that I felt really guilty about not being happy. I felt like I felt so self-centered, and there was so much self-loathing because of the fact that I'm like, what do I have to be sad about? Why am I miserable? Why am I depressed? Why am I suicidal? Like, why, just why? And so the thing was, is it got to such a paramount point when my relationship ended back in university, where I was so like, that was like the first bad thing that had like ever happened to me. And so it was one of those things where it's like, as a neutral, I was already miserable. Like my neutral was like just sad, depressed, down. So it's like I'd have good days where I'd be like, okay, this is great, and I'd have bad days where it was like, holy shit, this is rock bottom. But like my neutral was really not great. And so when I had this bad thing finally happen to me, I basically like snapped, and I was like, I need to talk about this, or like I'm literally gonna, like, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but like it won't be good. And so it was kind of one of those things where like I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't necessarily know if I wanted to talk to my friends yet. I didn't know if I wanted to talk to my family. I had been to therapists and that kind of stuff, and I'd kind of let it loose there, but I still wanted the people in my life to know, and I really wanted to kind of, like, as I said, do justice to like that young kid who was struggling a lot, and didn't think he had a reason, or didn't think he had the validation to be upset. And like literally that cliche of like, it's okay not to be okay, was like something that I just never, and mental health wasn't talked about at all, like when I was growing up. So I just thought I was just fucking upset. I was like, I'm just sad. I'm a sad person. So I was like, okay, like I gotta figure out who I want to talk to. And I'm a big believer that when you put things out into the universe, the people who need to find them will find them. And so I had a background in audio, and I was like, you know what, like this is an opportunity for me just to kind of like throw everything onto my computer, throw everything into a mic, put it out into the universe. And if my parents want to find it, if my friends want to find it, if anybody wants to find it, they can go find it on their own time. I don't want to burden anybody else with my story, but if they go and find it first, then it's not on me. I'm just saying, hey, here's my story. If you want to take the responsibility of going and listening to it, it's out there. And so that was the podcast for me, was just a first step in a very healthy path that I've been on.
It's interesting as we move forward and through like this technological revolution of like the internet and everyone having access to share their voice and whatnot. Like there's more pictures of us online, videos, audio of us talking. What's it gonna be like, do you think, when we're 35, maybe we're all still doing this podcast, you have a kid who's maybe 8 or you're older, and your kid's like getting to that age where they're consuming content and listening to people, and maybe they look up their dad's name and they get to like listen to your whole podcast or our whole podcast and like kind of understand who you are, where you were going with. I wonder though if that's actually a good thing, because remember our parents, they would say, oh yeah, back in the day I did this, and you'd see a picture and maybe a trophy or like some sort of like a diploma of some sort. You're like, but like, what were you really like? Now they're gonna see. What do you think about that? Do you think it's gonna be like a good, is that net positive for families and society?
Yes and no. I think it in my case, I know that I'm going to probably pass on some genes that aren't the best. My kid will be like a 6'2" stallion, but like he'll probably be mentally a bit, scrambled. But
throwing the racket around like you do in the court.
It's fine. Maybe he's got some anger issues kicking around.
Or is it's fine.
Performance
You're gonna
issues.
lose sometimes.
Performance issues. Yeah. So I've kind of, it's funny because like for the longest time I was like, when I was going through like the really shitty parts of mental health, I was like, I'm not going to have kids. I'm not passing this on to anybody else. Like this is not their task to like have to deal with. I'm not bringing something into this world and then being like, hey kid, here's depression. Like I'm just not, like that's just not something that I was willing to do. But like as I've gotten healthier and as I've learned more coping things, and just like in general, I'm like, yeah, like I'd love to have a kid one day, and I'd love for them to be able to listen to the podcast and understand that like dad's life wasn't perfect. Like dad struggled, and like I can go and talk to dad about these things. Granted, if you're making like if you're, I don't know, Supreme Patty and you're squeezing lemons into your eyes, dude, that was the only thing that popped into my head. I just saw a TikTok of him the other day, and I'm like, if that's you and like that's the kind of content that your kid's seeing, it's like, listen, I should say this. I have nothing but respect for anybody who's making content, whether it's like sex workers, whether it's people who are doing like prank things or whatever, whether things that I don't even necessarily agree with. I think if you're putting something out there and you're making yourself vulnerable, I have respect for you. But like, you know, the kind of content that you're putting out there, obviously now we do have to be conscious of the fact that our kids will see it. But I've created I think like the thing that I appreciate is like I've created a brand that's like not centered around perfection. I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm kind of like essentially like an anti-perfection brand, where it's like talking about you don't have to do things the right way. You can make mistakes. You don't have to live a life that's like streamlined. So yeah, I mean, I'm cool with seeing that. I'm sure your kids would love to know how, you know, Uncle Willie and Daddy Mose were doing back in university, you know, trying to get their stuff out there. So will I put everything on audio? Absolutely not. There's some stories that I'm going to take to my grave. Some stories I have with you guys that I'm going to take to my grave. But yeah, and that's fine. And that's cool. But like the stuff that I'm choosing to put out there, I'm comfortable with it existing forever.
It makes me a bit nervous letting my kids see exactly what I was like, you know?
Yeah, but
like,
if I was you, I'd be nervous too.
Yeah,
Oh, there we are.
Wow, there's the shot I was waiting for.
There it is.
We're about an hour into this. I had to take at least one.
It definitely makes me nervous because I feel like there's with the pod, like I look at like an actor back when there's no internet, you know, their kids got to see what they were like, or maybe like a late night show guy, but that's like a show.
Yeah.
This is like authentically who we are, you know. We're censoring some things, but you know, they get a real sense, and I just wonder if I hope they gain respect, understanding what we were like, and not lose it because they're like, oh, you were a dumb kid too, you know, who like said cringy things or did dumb stuff.
Yeah.
Like there is this mystique to our parents right now that you didn't get to see them when they were stupid, because we're all stupid at one point in our lives.
Absolutely.
Saying dumb things, being, you know, irresponsible, whatnot.
Jumping through pong tables.
So I don't know. Makes me a little nervous.
I you know what? I get that. Like, I understand what you mean. Definitely the lore behind your parents won't be as much of a thing anymore. And as you continue to go, like, you're just going to become like, people are just going to know their parents more and more and more and more.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy to think that like you hear about like your great, like this is the thing that like kind of gets to me is not as much my kid, but like my great grandchild would have complete access to how his great grandfather operated through life. And especially if you're going to be in the content creation world, if you're going to be pushing stuff out there, you are literally, for not the rest of your life necessarily, but for like the majority of your very important years, that all of that is going to be documented. So yeah, like that's the crazier thing to me, because it's like the only thing you hear about your great grandfather was that like, oh yeah, he fought in the war and he was a potato farmer, and you're like, oh yeah, I sound like a cool guy.
I wonder what that's like.
Yeah, I wonder how you living, man. How are you living? But like now it's like, oh shit, like wow, great grandpa was a fucking mental health podcaster, like you know what I mean? So,
but maybe the conversation's totally different at that time.
Hey,
maybe it's like, oh, he was so cool and ahead of the curve.
Or it's going to be like, hey, you know that statue there? That's my great grandfather. He started Life's a Wreck.
It's just you with like a giant wheel of a ship.
It's a giant wheel of a ship, and in the middle of the wheel is just the planet. It's just orbiting.
And a couple empty shotgun cans at the bottom.
And I'm just steering the boat.
Well, you mentioned
really, a couple
earlier,
empty guns.
You mentioned earlier, Morsey, there was people that were reaching out to you, telling you their stories, whether it was like maybe a suicide attempt or just, you know, being in a dark place. Like, obviously, I don't want you to share personal things like that are very private. But with podcast guests, like, do you have any experiences? Like, I was there for one with Shanetti.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the Drake story. It was kind of cool to hear.
Yeah.
What other stories or experiences have you had on the podcast that are like super crazy or maybe memorable, like sad?
I've only teared up with a guest once, and it was actually the most recent interview that I've done. I definitely, like, I always joked when I was a kid that, like, apart from being mentally a pigeon, I was not able to express emotions as openly as I would have liked to. It was something that didn't come easy for me. So I'm not a crier. Like, when it comes to like, if it's like movies or anything like that, like I don't cry very often. I've only cried a few times, very cathartic, you know, big, you know, when they do the movie about my life, that'll be like the climax. There'll be like a lot of like orchestral instruments happening. But I teared up with this last guest because the guy that I had on most recently, and the podcast episode will be coming out in about a month, give or take. He was a Marine for 10 years, who was a explosive expert. He lost both his legs in Afghanistan. He walked me through that entire, and I asked him, I said, like, I asked him what that day was like from the time he woke up to what he remembers. And essentially, and I don't want to give it away because it's like, it literally is probably my favorite interview that I've done. He essentially woke up that day. They were under heavy fire from the Taliban, and him and the group that he was with, they were trying to flank or something like that. And essentially he had this weird feeling that something was going to happen. He didn't know what, and eventually he got down, and he was trained in recognizing where mines might be. And so he said he just had this feeling, and he got down and he started to brush things away, and he was trying to find this because he had a feeling that there was a mine around. He saw certain piles that would have indicated that there was some digging that had happened. And basically he walked me through where, like, he saw this civilian coming from the distance, and he got up on one knee, and he told him to stop. And as he got up on that one knee, he shifted his weight, and the IUD was right underneath him, and he got thrown 30 feet back into a brick wall. And then he talks about just that entire process, and he starts to cry, and he talks about just like every single emotion that was going through his head, and he was so eloquently spoken. And that was the first time that I'd actually like teared up when listening to somebody's story. Because I think a huge thing about my podcast is I try to always kind of give it a bit of a light twist. I try to make sure that the conversation's as casual and fun and light as possible, because I want it to be easily digestible. It's a heavy topic, so with people who are casually listening, I want it to be easy for them to listen to. But with this guy, his story was just so raw and real, and you could, like, it was one of the first people where, like, you looked in his eyes and you're like, oh my God, I see this Marine. Like, there, I see the fear, I see like this longing, this wanting to live. Like, it was crazy. So that's definitely one of the, and then he ended up going on to win a Olympic or Paralympic gold medal in sledge hockey. So, like, unreal story, super sick. And another one, Chandler Worthy, was a really great guest that I had on. He plays for the Argos, and he talked about his experiences with, like, going to the pros and developing essentially like an anxiety towards, like, playing football, and talking about how he had, like, an identity crisis and didn't know who he was. Like, there have been just so many stories. Like, literally every single episode I've done, every single interview I've had, I could pick something out and talk about it for forever. But those two definitely stick out a lot. And then also, like, the episode that I've done with you guys and the one that I've done with my boys from out east, because it's kind of like coming full circle. It's like sitting down with my boys and talking about something that I wish I could have talked about years ago. So that's really cool as well. So yeah, I'd say those are the biggest ones.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing from athletes when they're like, I was scared to go on the field, or like fighters in the NHL. Like, I couldn't fall asleep during pregame nap. I'm just thinking about the guy I had to fight, because you always look up, you're like, this looks like the dream life, but there's a lot of stress and anxiety and maybe even depression that, like, is intertwined within that, like, lifestyle. But I think that's everything I have to ask and talk to you about, Mose, is there anything you want to close out on?
No, other than recently I think that I've proven that I can touch more on the bench than Morsey, so that's an interesting development, considering that he's probably got 20 pounds on me. But
20 pounds, buddy.
That's it for me.
You can't tell with the camera, but I'm bulked up, man.
I mean, the shirt's looking a little big on you, but that
it is. This is a triple XL actually, which is pretty sick.
Really?
No.
Wow.
No, absolutely not. But no, I definitely have been getting back in the gym, which has been great. You know, I thought I'd let you guys catch up during quarantine, but I'm back at it. So, you know, sit back down, get ready for second and third place.
Well, we're gonna lap Will, because Toronto just closed down all their gyms. And Thunder Bay is
I
still
feel, man, that's the thing is, like, you want to talk about mental health, COVID, out on the East Coast, this literally, I couldn't have asked for a better situation. I could still hang out with my friends. I can still, like, chill as long as we're responsible. Like, I've still been able to live my life, and that honestly has kept me sane.
No, for sure.
I'm scared for winter in Toronto. It is not going to be good.
Just spend it out on the East Coast. We'll go snowboarding. It'll be great.
Is there even a mountain in the East Coast?
Yeah, we have this, like, big hill, and there's, like, one guy at the top with a wheel, and he just kind of, like, pulls you up, and then you just slide down.
I would expect nothing less from the East Coast.
The hamster on the wheels running the internet. The big guy, we call him Big Al. He just cranks this big thing. Anyway, it's a great place. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, he's a giant. So that's it for this week. Thanks so much for coming on, Morsey.
Appreciate you guys. This is a lot of fun. I'm excited to see what you guys do with this. This was honestly a great conversation. It was a lot of fun.